Thank you for joining. It's great to see so many of you here. So this is a session on money and the stuff we buy, which is one of the topics that we touched on in the sort of overview session that we ran way back in, was it October and November last year? It was one of the topics, and basically we've been working through each of those topics. Yeah, so this is the running order that we've got for today. I'm going to try and stick to time more or less. We're going to have three people talking. There's myself, Ewan Jones, and then we've got Chrissy, who's a fairly new member of St George's who moved to Leeds during lockdown. So I'm guessing quite a few of you might not have met Chrissy. Chrissy's doing what's your PhD in, Chrissy? I'm sure I'll get it wrong if I try and say it.
Don't worry. It's in religious studies.
Okay.
Looking at evangelicalism.
Yeah, it was the specifics I wasn't sure about. So yeah. So welcome to Chrissy particularly, and then Izzy's going to be talking a bit about money towards the end, and we'll try and finish for around 9 o'clock. But I'm just going to pray briefly before we crack on. Lord, thank you for all the gifts and resources you've given us for the different ways that we earn money and the things that we can buy with that money, and for all the people that make and produce those things and get them to us in shops and various other ways, Lord. And we just pray that you'd help us as we think about how to be wise stewards of all those gifts that you've given us this evening, and that we'd be alert to what you're telling us about how to steward things wisely. Amen. Great. Okay. Oh, I have to admit some more people. That's popped up. Right. Okay. Here we go. So what sort of things do we mean when we talk about money and the stuff we buy? Essentially, it's everything. Almost everything we buy has a carbon footprint. If you take a look around the different rooms that you're all in and consider the energy and resources that have gone into making and transporting items to where they are now, this includes the screens that you're watching this on, and it includes the chairs that we're sat on and the clothes that we're wearing. Some of the items will cause more greenhouse gas emissions whilst being used, as well as when they're being made. So anything that uses electricity or gas, for example. And then when we've finished using these items, it will often take some more resources to dispose of them, however we choose to do that. It's pretty much impossible to buy even basic essentials like clothing without having some environmental impact. So we're not saying that we're going to be able to avoid it completely, but there are lots of things that we can do to reduce the environmental impact substantially. Today, we're going to be focusing on carbon emissions in particular, which is the environmental impact that I and many others are most concerned about. There are also CO2 emissions associated even with the money we might be lucky enough to have in the bank or another financial institution. And that's particularly what Izzy's going to talk about towards the end. Some of you, if you were at the first session we ran last year, might remember this pie chart. We talked through each part of it, each slice of the pie chart. It's showing the carbon footprint breakdown for the average person in the UK. I'm just going to see if I can move this out of the way. No, it keeps popping up there. So it's the average carbon footprint for someone in the UK. There's a huge variety in the things we buy and where we might keep money when we're not spending it. So with the time we have today, we're not going to try and cover everything. I will start by going through some principles that can be helpful to think about when considering any type of purchase. Then with Izzy and Chrissy, we're going to look at a few specific product types in some more detail. So I'm going to talk through, I couldn't come up with a better title than a framework for thinking about purchases.
You're not full screen yet.
Well, I'm going to try to do it.
If you could mute yourselves, that would be really helpful. Thank you. In the first sessions we ran last year, we mentioned a really helpful book called How Bad Are Bananas? This is a diagram I've borrowed from the author of that book, although it's not in the book itself. It's a helpful framework for thinking about the impacts of different stages of a product's life cycle. Things are made, we use them, and then we decide what to do with them when we've finished with them. Some items will last longer than others, so they will move through these steps at different speeds. When we decide to buy something, energy is used to make it. It might involve using land, cutting down trees to mine minerals, or to grow a crop. Then the item is packaged and transported to us, releasing more CO2. Some items release CO2 when we use them, if the item uses energy, such as an appliance or a car, and we often need to maintain the item by cleaning it or by buying spare parts. Then when we've finished with it or it breaks, we have to decide whether to recycle it, give it away, throw it away, or to repair it. And we also have a decision to make at the start of this process. We have to decide if we actually need the item, and if so, what type? How long will it last? Can I fix it if it breaks? Can we borrow it? Or could we buy one that's second-hand? So I thought it would be helpful to talk through a couple of examples of how we might apply this. If we've decided that we need to buy a chair, the majority of the impact is from its manufacture and a little from the end of its life. There's a small amount of maintenance needed, but generally that's just a little bit of cleaning. If we buy a poor quality product, then it's unlikely to last very long and we'll need to replace it frequently, and this will increase the environmental impact substantially. If it's a design that can be easily repaired, then that can help to extend its lifetime. But beware of Trigger's paradox for fans of Only Fools and Horses. So I've picked a few examples of different types of chair that we might choose here. On the left is a classic school chair. It's plastic and metal. The plastic is a type that can be recycled. The steel legs can also be recycled. It's easy to clean, but if it gets broken, then it's quite difficult to repair. In the middle is a leather chair with stainless steel legs. The legs, again, can be recycled, but repair would be difficult for the same reasons. And recovering the seat, if it got torn or stained, would be a very skilled job. A classic wooden chair, like the third option, can be recovered, repainted, and revarnished several times. If part of the frame breaks, then it can often be replaced, glued, or screwed back together. And those are all jobs that certainly I'd feel fairly comfortable having a go at. The way we're going to use the chair is also important, though. So if it's going to need frequent cleaning, then a finish that's easy to clean is definitely helpful. Just a brief tangent at this point on wood. Trees and all plants absorb CO2 when they're growing. This is great, but if the trees we use for timber and paper are not replaced, then less CO2 is being absorbed. As consumers, we can look for this FSC logo, which tells us that the forest the tree came from is well managed and that the trees will either be replanted or allowed to regrow naturally. And you can find this logo on wood if you're buying it in a hardware shop, or furniture and paper products. So just picking one other example, a fridge clearly uses energy during its use, and unlike most appliances, it's on all the time. So its energy use is even more important. We can look at the energy label on the fridge to find out how efficient it is. The energy label system started several years ago with a scale from G being the least efficient up to A for the most efficient, but the scheme was very successful. So the new levels have been added, A+, A++, and A++ now. That's great, but it started to get quite confusing because A rated sounds good, but it's actually the fourth level from the top now. So the labeling system is going to be reorganized at some point this year, and I can't quite find out when, so that it's from A to G again. Basically, they'll redefine all the bands. Because of the speed of this progress, a second-hand fridge is probably not a great idea unless we know that it's pretty new and preferably know its energy label rating. Then we also need to think about the size. A big, highly efficient fridge will generally still use more energy than a smaller one that's slightly less efficient. At the end of the life of the fridge, we need to make sure it's disposed of properly because it contains a refrigerant gas, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Leeds Council will take fridges and freezers to dispose of them. But if you leave them on the street waiting for them to pick them up, then you might find that someone comes along and rips out the compressor, which is the bit at the back, because the scrap metal it's made from, which is copper, is very valuable. Doing this releases all the refrigerant inside, and it's typically equivalent to about a ton of CO2 because it's that potent, which is the same as driving a car about 5,000 miles. We buy all sorts of different things and they all have different impacts. I've produced this graphic based on a different book called Carbon Detox, which is by George Marshall, which I think Izzy mentioned in the last presentation. Some of the figures in the book are a bit out of date now, but I've found the way he explains the relative impacts of different goods and services very helpful. He groups everything into 4 categories. At the high end, we have items that take a lot of energy to make. A lot of this energy is to do with extracting and refining different minerals, and especially
Have you got the camera on there?
Yeah.
Especially in making computer chips and other electronic components. At the other end of the scale, there are some uses of money that we can do that have a positive impact. These are things that contribute to the changes that we need to see to mitigate climate change. An obvious example would be renewable energy or energy efficiency measures, or giving money to a charity that's active on climate issues. There are lots of low impact things that we can buy as well. These are often things that are second-hand or involve a lot of human labor, where per pound spent, the impact is quite low. So things like childcare, hairdressers, cleaners, or custom-made furniture. He then puts everything else in a medium category, which you might think is a little unhelpful, but it's a simplification of the reality. The things we buy could be anywhere on this spectrum, but I find it's helpful to remember what characteristics put things towards one end or the other. Computer chips at the high end, human labor at the low end. And of course, there are anomalies as well. I've mentioned the old second-hand fridge perhaps not being a great option, and solar panels, whilst they're very energy intensive to make, they'll offset that manufacturing impact in about 4 years, and the panels should last for at least 25. So the net impact is still beneficial. So the aim we might come up with is to shift our spending from one end towards the other. There will be things towards the upper end that we still need to buy, but we can shift the emphasis. So this triangle is normally called the waste hierarchy, but I think it puts too much emphasis on the negative waste side. So I've renamed it the stuff hierarchy. The idea is that the image shows the order in which we should think through how to reduce the impacts of the stuff we own, particularly when we're disposing of them. The first step here is to reduce the amount we use. This should save some money, which is helpful, and it may even allow us to save enough to spend it on something with a positive impact. This brings 2 things to mind. Some of you may remember a sermon given by Mark Powley several years ago now, which drew on the book he's written called Consumer Detox. I should admit at this point that I've not actually read the book, but it's for a really good reason. We did have a copy, which Izzy read, but then inspired by the book, she gave it to someone so that they wouldn't need to use resources in buying their own copy. So if anyone has a copy that they'd like to lend me, that would be great. Anyway, I do remember in excuse me, in Mark's sermon, he said something along the lines of, "Who wants to be richer than a king?" And then he said, "You already are. We're all richer than the wealthiest people who lived a few hundred years ago." And this, when he said it, reminded me of this image, which I first saw when I was a teenager. It's one of a series of photos taken by photographer Peter Menzel in 1994. He went around the world asking different families in different countries to bring all their possessions out in front of their house. This photo is a family in Bhutan. There are contrasting images from families in countries like America and different parts of the world. I remember looking at some of them in the mid-90s and thinking there is a huge amount of stuff in the American family's photo. But now looking at it again, it doesn't look so unusual. Our expectations have changed. There's a wider point here as well, that it's very easy to think, I can't afford to take the green option. But often the green option is to not buy the item or to use less of it or buy less of it. Generally, if we're wealthy, then we'll almost certainly have a higher carbon footprint just because we've got more stuff, including the money in the bank. So don't be fooled by hype as well. Just because a product is marketed as a green product, it doesn't mean you're damaging the environment if you don't buy it. Not buying it might well be just as green or perhaps greener, especially if it's an unnecessary item with a green badge on it. I already mentioned the second step of reuse in reference to Mark's book. By giving something a second lease of life, we reduce the demand for new stuff and delay the item being thrown away. There are lots of places we can buy or sell second-hand items. Some of these aren't exclusively markets for second-hand. Some, like eBay, sell a lot of new stuff as well. I've not used all of these, but I have used eBay lots of times, and Freegal is an easy way to give items away whilst all the charity shops are closed. Something Izzy and I have also used a lot is Seagull's Paint, which is based just off Kirkstall Road. They take leftover paint and sell it on. They'll mix different colours for you, and the staff are really skilled at doing that. Sooner or later, a lot of the things we own will break or need some sort of maintenance. When this happens, we have a choice to fix the issue or to buy a new thing. In some cases, the item might be beyond repair. If the item is something that uses a lot of energy in its use, then in some cases, the lower carbon option might be to get a more efficient version. It's generally only true for things that use a lot of energy. I've mentioned the fridge. Anyway, you might have read this recent news story, which is about a new law that should make it easier to repair items, as manufacturers will be required to make spare parts available. Another great resource is YouTube, which has loads of videos explaining how to fix all sorts of things. And if you don't feel up to doing it yourself, you may be able to find someone else to help. There's also the Leeds Repair Cafe, where items can be fixed by volunteers for free. Their Facebook page seems to say that they are offering some help online as well. So that brings us to recycling, which many people think of as the first option. On the face of it, recycling is about resource efficiency. Recycling materials means we don't need to grow or dig up as much stuff, but it's also to do with climate change. There are two reasons recycling helps to reduce climate change. The first is that it reduces the amount of land humans use, mining, metal, etc. Because whilst wood growing does absorb CO2, and if humans are growing that, that's great. But the diverse range of plants that would have naturally grown there if we hadn't interfered with the land will almost certainly be absorbing more CO2. So that's one reason. The other reason is to do with energy. Making materials from their raw ingredients generally takes a lot more energy than recycling the same material. This graph compares the energy needed to produce a ton of steel from virgin materials with that used to recycle the same material. It's about a fifth, basically. PET is the plastic that most drinks bottles are made out of, and that shows a similar trend. So we'll have a quick quiz at this point. maybe call out your answers or write them in the chat. Different materials can be recycled different numbers of times, some a lot, some very few. So can anyone tell me how often or how many times a piece of metal, different metals, could be recycled? I can't see the chat. Izzy's going to tell me if someone writes.
1,000.
Okay, so we've had a few answers there. For metals, it is infinite. I believe Johnny got that right. Plastics now. Again, there are lots of different types of plastic, so there's a bit of variation.
Just once.
Yeah, so you're all okay. So most of the answers range from 1 to 3. You're about right. I think my understanding is that technically it's 2 or 3, but the reality is once it's been recycled once, you can't really tell if it's been recycled once or twice. So the reality is it tends to only happen once. Oh, I've given away the answer for paper. The reason for that is that the fibers in the paper get shortened each time they get recycled, they snap. And anyone want to guess on glass?
Infinite?
Infinite again, yes. Yeah, loads of times. So yeah, obviously different materials do different jobs, so we can't substitute everything with metal and glass, but it's helpful to understand that. So almost the final option. If the item has no use to anyone, cannot be fixed, and the materials cannot be recycled, then we could burn it and use the energy from its being burnt in place of fossil fuels that we might have otherwise had to use. In Leeds, this is actually what happens to our black bin waste. You may recognise this building. Our black bin waste goes here and is sorted to remove anything that ought to have gone in the recycling, and then the remainder is burnt. You might be concerned about the fumes from this, but around a third of the building is occupied by a fume filtration system, which aims to remove all the worrying chemicals before they go up the chimney. The energy from burning it is used to generate electricity and heat. The electricity goes into the national grid, and the heat is piped to the city centre in insulated pipes. The photo here is some of those insulated pipes being installed. I took this when I did a survey as part of my job last year. The hot water inside the pipes is used to give heating and hot water to any nearby building that wants to connect. At the moment, it's mostly the council's buildings, but it's open to anyone that's close enough to the network. And finally, the last resort is to dispose of the item in landfill. The materials and energy that went into making the item are at the end of the road. One day there might be enough demand for the materials to make it worth digging them up again, but we're not at that point yet. So I've rattled through that fairly quickly because time was a little tight, but we're now going to move on to what Chrissy's going to tell us about clothing and fashion.
Hi everyone. So yeah, as you introduced me a little bit before, I'm Chrissy. I'm a PhD student. Joined St George's when I moved here in September, so still relatively new. So it's nice to meet you all virtually if I haven't met you before. And as Ian said, I'm gonna take us through thinking about one aspect of things that we buy and spend our money on, and that's to do with clothes and fashion. Now, I appreciate that not everyone will think the term fashion might apply to them or it's something that they're not interested in. I'm just using the term fashion industry, but by that I mean everything to do with, clothes, shoes, garments. So don't be put off by that. If you're questioning whether or not this applies to you, yes, it does, because we all wear clothes. So I'm just going to go through kind of three sections or points on this topic. First, we'll look at the impact of clothes manufacturing and the fashion industry on the climate. Spoiler alert, it's not good. Second, we'll look at some of the progress and positive changes that have happened in recent years. And then finally, we'll go through what we can do and some sustainable changes that we can make. Okay. So first, the impact of the fashion industry. As you'll know, in this series of webinars, we're thinking about climate change, and the fashion industry is a big contributor to the climate crisis. A key factor in this has been the spectacular growth of what's called the fast fashion industry. This is an industry and also a business model oriented around mass producing lots and lots of low-cost clothes, which are trendy and fashionable. The idea being that everyday people can get the latest styles, keep their wardrobes up to date, and then move on to the next trend. But this means that kind of more broadly, clothes are intended to be cheap, they're often disposable, don't last very long because they're made with low quality materials, which means clothes degrade after not that many years, or wears even sometimes, it's not even years. So clothes can often get thrown away after being worn a handful of times and then end up going into landfill. So this low cost fashion really spiraled in kind of the late 1990s and 2000s. Between 2000 and 2014, clothing production globally doubled. Compared to 15 years ago, the average consumer now buys 60% more clothes, and clothing items are kept half as long as well. So there are lots of issues surrounding fast fashion in terms of the environment more broadly, and ethical problems as well, which I'll mention in a minute. But a key thing to note is the impact on the climate. So the clothes and footwear industry is responsible for 10% of annual global carbon emissions. This is actually more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. And at its current pace, the fashion industry's greenhouse gas emissions will surge more than 50% by 2030, so less than 10 years' time. So, we think of reducing the amount we fly or drive, but sometimes forget that when we buy a product such as clothing item or a pair of shoes, it's already had a life cycle that impacts the climate before it even reaches us. So this is a real problem, and it means that the industry isn't on track to meet the targets which are in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement and the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Both of these require limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So to meet this target, the clothes industry would need to reduce its annual emissions by 1.1 billion tonnes in the next decade. This is about half of its current figure, which is about 2.1 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions each year. So there's a lot to do there in terms of how the fashion industry impacts the Paris Agreement targets for global carbon emissions. So the impact on global warming, that's one way the fashion industry is harming our planet. But there's also other ways that it's a problem as well, including kind of broader environmental and ethical concerns as well. So the impact on the environment in particular is really wide ranging because clothing has very complex supply chains. There are lots of stages to the manufacturing process, from harvesting the raw fibre, processing this into fabric, treating it, maybe through bleaching or dye, and then turning that into a garment as well. And then there's also how it's transported to consumers and what happens when it's disposed of, kind of as Ewan's already gone through what we do with clothes and things at the end of their life cycle. So, for example, the fashion industry really uses excessive amounts of water. Every year it uses 93 billion cubic meters of water. To put that in context or perspective, that's enough to meet the water consumption needs of 5 million people. And in terms of water waste, around 20% of wastewater globally comes from fabric dyeing treatment. And the fashion industry is the second largest polluter of clean water globally after agriculture as well. There's also this issue of plastic microfibers. So these are tiny bits of plastic that are shed by clothes. Lots of fabrics contain plastics, most commonly polyester, but also nylon, acrylic, things like that. And every time we wash these materials, they shed millions of plastic microfibers, and they're so small that they can drain out of our washing machine straight through water treatment plants and into the ocean as well. And then, of course, we've got lots of clothes that also end up in landfill as well. every year, an estimated 300,000 tonnes of clothing ends up in UK landfill. And it's not just cheap materials and processes that are used as well, but also cheap labour is a key component as well. The world had quite a big reality check in 2013 when a clothes factory called Rana Plaza in Bangladesh collapsed, and this actually killed over 1,000 workers. So it was a really devastating event. And at this point, there was a bit of a shift. Consumers started to question the true cost of cheaper clothes because people's lives had been put at risk in order to complete orders on time. So people started to discover that garment workers were being exploited, that they had dangerous working conditions. And you can see a few kind of stats just on the screen there, that 1 in 6 people worldwide work in the garment industry, but lots of them don't have any rights or protections, and only 2% earn a living wage. So often all these concerns about people and planet will come together. People have started looking for clothes that are both sustainably sourced and ethically made. Today, we are looking more just at the impact on climate change, but it's good to note the other issues with the fashion industry, not least because if you make a positive change in your kind of consumer habits, you're actually making a difference in lots of different ways all in one go. So that brings us to kind of what progress has been made recently. We've had a bit of a reality check. We've seen lots of statistics about how the clothes industry is damaging the climate and thwarting progress towards the Paris and IPCC climate targets. But there is a growing awareness of these issues, and there's been attempts to try and change the path that the industry is on. And I think it's good to note these changes that have been made, because a lot of what we've looked at has been very heavy. It's really easy to get bogged down by the weight of it all. So I thought it'd be good just to go through some good progress. And this way we can kind of frame our understanding, not so much as despair at what's going on, but being able to join in with a positive movement for change that's making an impact. So one example is that in 2018, the UN Alliance on Sustainable Fashion was established. This is an initiative of the United Nations, which aims to contribute to their Sustainable Development Goals. You might have heard of these before. If you haven't, it's a set of 17, I think, goals, which they set back in 2015, and the aim is to achieve them by 2030. It includes things like zero poverty, no hunger, gender equality, and climate action. So this alliance aims to bring about these targets through coordinated action within the clothes and fashion sector. And they've called for the use of new materials so that clothes last longer. And some kind of big name brands have responded by working to identify fibre alternatives and develop more eco-friendly processes as well. There's also the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action, which was launched in 2018. So you might know that this year is COP26 being held in the UK. This charter was launched back at COP24. And the main goal here is to drive the fashion industry to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by no later than 2050. And this was also organised by the UN. And lots of famous companies have signed up to the charter. So people like Adidas, Gap, H&M Group, Regatta, Nike signed up as well. Another example is this organisation called Fashion Revolution. This was actually founded in response to the Bangladesh clothes factory collapse that I mentioned before. And their vision is to end the way the fashion industry exploits both people and the environment. They have a really helpful, it's called the Fashion Transparency Index, which they republish every year, which ranks companies on how much they disclose about their environmental and social practices. And there's also things like campaigns and movements online, one of which is Who Made My Clothes. So people will tag a brand on social media with the hashtag Who Made My Clothes, which basically asks for transparency in their supply chain. This is more focused on kind of the ethical change, but having this transparency is really useful because making clothes can be a very complex process. So knowing exactly how they're made, who makes them and where is also helpful for challenging the ways it harms the environment as well. Okay, so that brings us to what we can do as consumers. How can we carbon detox from the ways our clothes are damaging the climate? And all of these initiatives and campaigns we've looked at give us some really good examples. So number one, I'd say, is to simply buy new products less. This was at the very top of Ewan's kind of inverted triangle, I think, as well. So perhaps if you tend towards impulse buying, I mean, I can definitely relate to that. That was me a few years ago. Ask yourself why before you buy. You might prefer to shop secondhand. There's lots of ways you can do this online now. There's an app called Depop, which I think Ewan briefly mentioned before, where people will sell used clothes. This is particularly good for younger people who are looking for kind of things that are trendy. There's things like online clothes swaps. If anyone wants any recommendations, feel free to ask me at any point. But then there's also the good old-fashioned charity shops, which I've honestly found some really great stuff in charity shops. Love a good charity shop. You could wear your clothes longer as well, so trying to extend their life cycle would help with that. If you wash it less and according to label instructions, that will really help. That was something that I definitely learned in recent years, because as a student I would just chuck everything in the washing machine and put it all at the same temperature. Number two is don't throw things away. When things get on a bit, you could learn how to repair it or upcycle it in a creative way, and also donate it to these kind of places that you would buy things secondhand from if it's got a bit of life left in it. Number three is be a smart consumer. So sometimes we will need to buy things new, no shame in that. But we can look to spend our money kind of with companies who are more environmentally friendly or who are making like good progress towards that. So look out for information on who made the product, what the company is like. Maybe they have a sustainable criteria for their clothes. So this is just an example here. If you go into M&S, they sometimes have on the walls that they're part of the Better Cotton initiative, which aims to make cotton production better for the environment and workers. And on the subject of cotton, one really good thing to think about as a consumer is what fabric your clothes are. So earlier I mentioned the carbon emissions that come from the fashion industry. And this graph here breaks down the greenhouse gas emissions of clothes and footwear in terms of their lifespan. And so you can see that much of it happens before it hits the shop. So this is, if you can't read it, this one here is retail. So you have all of this happening before it even gets to the shops. And most of the industry's emissions then happen from what's called upstream operations, which is all the way down here. So things like material production, preparation, processing, as these are all very energy intensive. So things like operating machinery, weaving, fibre production all require energy and emit greenhouse gases. And this big block on the left here is just material production. So that's why thinking about what your clothes are made of is a really good place to start. So what fabrics are better then? Natural fibres are better than synthetic fibres as their production emits less CO2, in short. They're not all equal, but generally things like wool, cotton and linen, especially organic if you can get it, are the best. Hemp, I've included, is good too if you can get it, but it's quite expensive. Ones to avoid would be things like nylon, acrylic, polyester and viscose. Those two at the bottom I think are particularly popular with kind of cheaper clothes. Just to kind of put it in perspective, a shirt that's made from polyester has double the carbon footprint compared to one made with cotton. So that's just a really easy swap that you can make. So when you're shopping for something new, maybe just have a feel of the garment, look at the label to see what kind of fabric it is. And if after this session you want to be a smart consumer, but you've forgotten some things, I'd recommend just looking for resources that can point you in the right direction. If you have a smartphone, there's an app that you can get called Good On You, and this is just some screenshots of like what it looks like. So you basically go to the app, search a company in the search bar here, and it ranks them on their sustainability. It also gives you suggestions of similar or perhaps better alternatives, and gives an idea of their prices as well, so you can see what will fit your budget. If you don't use apps or have a smartphone, but you do have an internet connection, then you can get the Fashion Transparency Index, which I mentioned earlier. You can Google this, but I'll put a link to it in the slides as well. just in case anyone wants to get that. And this basically, it has rankings of lots of different brands like this. So they're too small to see the individual names here, but this is just a screenshot which gives you a picture of how it looks. So lots of brands will be given a different percentage, and then you could look for some familiar names and see whether or not you want to shop there based on how low down or high up the list they are. So that's just a summary of ideas of what we can do individually as consumers. Of course, a lot of it depends on your budget, your lifestyle, but making just that one change could be a really positive step. For some, it might be buying from sustainable companies. For others, it might mean just making sure you're taking care of the clothes that you already own. This quote on the screen here, I really like. The most sustainable garment is the one already in your wardrobe, which is kind of what you were saying before about just reducing the amount of things that you buy. So I think that sums up really well. So it's kind of just a case of doing what you can. Don't overwhelm yourself with like shame or judgment, but just try to keep learning, keep moving forward. Yeah, so that brings me to the end. I've just added a slide here with just a few resources if you're looking for things to engage with. There's a few kind of books here, plus a documentary that's available on Amazon Prime if anyone has Prime Video, and a podcast with the link there just about making things last longer. So feel free to come back to the slides for those. But overall, my hope is that although I've given you some alarming statistics, I haven't scared you too much. But that if this is something you haven't really thought about much before, it might be the beginning of a kind of new journey or process of thinking about it. So I know that's kind of a lot of content, but I hope you'll be inspired to go out and learn more and engage with it personally. And as I said at the beginning, even if you're not that into fashion, we all wear clothes. So it's good to think about.
So just going to briefly talk about electronics and data. So I've based this graph on data from a book that we mentioned before. It's called How Bad Are Bananas? Earlier I mentioned that computer chips take a lot of energy to make. And one impact of that is that the CO2 from the manufacture of a laptop, for example, is a big proportion of the total CO2 over its lifetime. The average laptop is used for just between 3 and 5 years before it's at least passed on as a second-hand item or disposed of. But if it's looked after and is a good quality machine, then it can last much longer than that. This means that the CO2 from using the laptop gradually becomes a more significant part of the total. This second graph shows the value of keeping a laptop going for several years. With each year we keep it running, the CO2 per hour of use gets lower and lower as that initial chunk of CO2 from its manufacture is shared over more and more hours. Some of you will have noticed that on the first graph, the CO2 from the energy the laptop uses is actually less than that from the data centers that we are calling on when we access the internet, assuming that that's what we're doing. A lot of resources go into building and running and maintaining the internet with tens of millions of servers running around the clock so that we can communicate around the world at any time. This has lots of benefits, not least that we can save the need for travel often, but the amount of CO2 emissions from our internet use is roughly proportional to the amount of data that we use. And there are things that we can do to reduce our internet data use. But overall, this is a small part of our total carbon emissions. Globally, data centers are about 0.25% of global emissions. The way we choose to send and receive data can have an effect on CO2 emissions. So I thought it would be helpful to compare the data used to send a message saying hello. The most efficient way to do this is to type it, but we might want to express ourselves with a picture or a sound recording or even a video. This graph shows the amount of data each of those options might use. The video is the most data hungry, but the quality or resolution of the video makes a big difference. If we're being frugal, we generally might have the option to select a lower data option. But especially whilst we're in lockdown, I'm not saying don't make a video call, but if we're watching a video on iPlayer or something similar, then perhaps only select the high quality picture if you think it's important, and maybe see if there's a lower quality one that does the job, especially if you're only listening to the sound. An easy thing I did recently was to delete unwanted emails, marketing and other spam. Over about a decade, my email account had accumulated about 20,000 emails that I could quickly identify and delete just by where they'd come from. If we keep them, then they're being stored on servers that are always on and always being maintained and upgraded. Right, so now Izzy's going to join us to talk about money.
Hello. Hi, yeah, so money, can be a difficult topic. So why talk about money and climate change? Well, as we all know, if we've got any kind of savings or pension, the bank isn't just keeping our money in a bank vault, they're investing it. And they might be investing it in wind turbines, or they might be investing it in coal-fired power stations or coal mines. Even if you only have a current account and that account doesn't always have a lot of money in it, it's still worth considering which bank you're using. Because if a lot of people switch to the greener banks, it sends a powerful message to those banks that are behind on the climate agenda. And some really are behind, as this graphic illustrates. But others are ahead and are investing in the green revolution. So it's like voting. One vote alone might not seem a lot, but collectively our votes set political agendas. Some people would say that looking at where our money is the most important, one of the most important things we can do. I've got a few quiz questions in this section. So this is your first question. Does anybody know who this is? Just turn the chat on so I can actually see any suggestions. I must be able to see it. Here we are. Think media, entertainment in the 90s, more behind the scenes than behind the camera.
Is it Richard Curtis?
Yes, it is.
Hey.
Yeah, well done. So yeah, Richard Curtis, the brains behind Blackadder, Four Weddings and a Funeral, and so on, and also was heavily involved in comic relief, still is, I think. But he's recently set up a campaign which focuses on trying to get pension providers to provide net zero pensions, i.e. net zero carbon emissions pensions. And I heard him speaking about this on the Outrage and Optimism podcast. And he explained that one thing that got him into this issue was realizing that there are thousands of vegans funding the meat industry, for example, and climate activists funding coal without even realizing it. Because most people, he explained, most people don't even realize what their pensions are being invested in on their behalf. And people tend to be over optimistic about how ethical their pensions might be. And also, he said that he realised after years of working on comic relief that the UK aid budget was £15 billion in 2019, 15 billion, sorry, whereas the UK pensions pot is £3 trillion. So our pensions can also have a lot of power for good if they're invested wisely. So we need to be moving our money away from fossil fuels and carbon intensive industries and towards low carbon technologies. That's what we call divestment, a divestment from fossil fuels. But does it really make a difference? Well, this is a quote from Shell's strategic report 2018. I put the link there to show this is genuine. Some groups are pressuring certain investors to divest their investments in fossil fuel companies. If this were to continue, it could have a material adverse effect on the price of our securities. Our ability to use financing for future projects may be adversely impacted. So it sounds like their cage is starting to be rattled. This is another example. one of Trump's last actions as president was to push through the highly controversial sale of leases to drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, which is home to wild polar bears, caribou, and home to several groups of native peoples. However, when the leases were offered for sale on the 6th of January this year, no major oil companies bid at all. And of the 22 areas of land up for lease, 2 were bought by small companies, 9 were bought by an Alaskan state agency, which was only really bidding as a stopgap if there were no other bidders. And the rest of the areas of land were not bought. So the sale made 125 times less revenue than was predicted. And one of the reasons cited for the failure of the sale was that companies would find it very difficult to borrow the money to pay for drilling projects, because more than 60 financial institutions around the world, including all 5 major US banks, have pledged to stop or restrict funding for Arctic oil exploration. So that's a bit of a good news story. So another thing people might ask is divestment risky? You know, people maybe think that fossil fuels are a good investment, so maybe I should stick with them. This is another quiz question. Can anyone guess what all these institutions might have in common? And it's a slightly leading question. Put an answer in the chat. So we've got the UK's biggest pension fund, Church of Ireland, half of UK universities, Pension Fund of the Welsh Assembly, Royal College of GPs, the Irish government, New York City, and state public pension funds. No guesses? Well, I'll tell you. All zero carbon. Yeah, well, pretty much. So they've all either divested from fossil fuels or committed to divest from fossil fuels. So it's becoming more mainstream. It's estimated around $14.5 trillion have been divested from fossil fuels by more than 1,300 institutions globally. That's where I got that from. Another quiz question. This is probably a bit harder. Does anybody know who this is?
That's Mark Carney.
Oh, well done. Top marks here.
Who wrote a very good, well, there was a very good Simon Hattenston interview with him in The Guardian magazine that I can recommend. It was 10 days ago. On the Guardian website.
I can recommend his Wreath lectures too.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to refer to that. So, yeah, so Mark Carney, for anyone who doesn't know, is a former governor of the Bank of England. And he has repeatedly warned of the financial risks of continuing to invest in fossil fuels, because the world is moving away from fossil fuels. So their future is limited. Research shows that in order to meet the Paris goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, we have to keep the vast majority of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. I've heard different calculations. One calculation I heard from earlier this year is that we can only burn 1/12 of known fossil fuel reserves. So if we do manage to meet the Paris goals, fossil fuel investments will have become almost worthless within the next few decades. And if we don't manage to meet the Paris goals, the global economy will be massively hit. Anyway, this is a quote from the Wreath lecture, which Stuart actually mentioned. This is Mark Carney. We won't have a financial system if we don't have a planet. It sounds more like Greta Thunberg quote, but that's the former governor of the Bank of England. But he's also pointed out that there are huge opportunities for companies that are taking the lead on the transition to the low carbon economy to profit from that. And this is one more quiz question. I won't ask for answers in the chat. You can just think about it. But again, it's a leading question. This graph shows the performance of 2 share indices, one that includes fossil fuels, and then the same share index but excluding fossil fuel companies. Don't worry if you don't really understand what that means. I don't really to any depth either, but the thing is, can you guess which is the one with fossil fuels and which is the one without, as in which shares performed better? I'll tell you, because as I said, it's a leading question. It's actually the one without fossil fuels that has performed better in recent years, the blue line at the top. So fossil fuels are already not as good as an investment as people might think. So what can we do as individuals? Well, we can think about which financial institutions we're customers of, what's their approach to climate change and fossil fuel investments, and we might choose to move our money if we're not happy with the approach these institutions are taking. So we're going to just put that into practice now. I'd like you to grab a piece of paper or something you can write on and just jot down all the financial products you have, or the main ones, and which institutions they're with, which bank or building society they're with. Just the ones you can think of off the top of your head. You don't need to start rifling through your paperwork. And don't worry, you're not going to be asked to share this with anyone. There isn't a breakout room on this topic. So I'll just give you a minute or two to do that. Think about the categories on the slide. Okay, we'll move on to what we're going to do with that information. If you have a look at your list, leave the pension for now. We're going to look at that in a minute. What I'd like to do is just, I've got a little bit of time now for you to have a look at this website. If you could just put the link in the chat as well to make it easier for you to go on. This is a very simple website that has a drop-down menu with most of the UK banks on it, and it rates them in terms of their climate change impact. So you just choose your bank and then it'll give this rating: great, good, below our standard, terrible. If your bank gets a bad rating, it suggests an alternative bank, well, the ones with the great ratings that you might want to consider at a future point in time switching to. Just to cut to the chase, the ones they put as great are Triodos, Co-op and Nationwide. Although they do point out that that's not a recommendation, but they're the ones at the top ethical rating. We're customers of two of them. I've not had any problems, but yeah, you might find if you've got accounts with building societies, they're not all listed on there, but generally building societies tend to be a safe bet anyway in terms of climate change, because they tend to invest mostly in buildings and lending to their members, so they don't tend to have large investments such as in fossil fuel industries. So admittedly they're unlikely to be investing in the renewable revolution either, so if you might want to think about shifting some money to organizations that are specifically choosing to make positive investments. Triodos is one that springs to my mind, but I'll just give a few minutes for you to have a look at that website, because I know sometimes we think we'll get round to this another day and we don't, so I thought I'd just make that time now. Right, Ewan's telling me to move on. If you've got more accounts to look up, you know where the website is anyway, to come back to it. And so the next one, as I said, if you have a pension, we come back to it. So that's the time we're coming back to the pensions. So most of us probably don't have the ability to change our pension provider, because we might be with a, if we're lucky enough to have a pension, we might be with an occupational pension. But we can contact our pension provider and ask them to what their policies are, or to change them if we're not happy with their policies. The campaign I mentioned earlier that Richard Curtis has started, that's the Make My Money Matter campaign. On this website, you can send a very simple email that they've written for you to your pension provider. Again, there's a drop-down menu. You choose your pension provider, and then you can send the email. You could do it in like 2 minutes. Or if you don't have a pension, they also have a petition on that website you can sign. Or if, like me, you're a West Yorkshire Pension Fund member, they're not listed on the Make My Money Matter website, but there is a whole separate campaign for the West Yorkshire Pension Fund to divest from fossil fuels, because they're particularly bad in terms of their levels of investment in fossil fuels. And some recent research showed that the West Yorkshire Pension Fund has lost £211 million, I think it was, in fossil fuel investments due to reducing cost of the oil shares, value of the oil company shares. So again, I'll just give like a minute, just a couple of minutes, just to click on the link that's relevant to you, for you, and put them in the chat again. Probably not long enough to send the email, although if you want to just literally just send it, you can do, but at least you can click on the link, maybe bookmark it to do on another occasion. So yeah, if you do have the ability to change your pension provider, then you might want to look at the Ethical Consumer website. This is actually useful for all sorts of things, whether you're like buying a sofa or a fridge or whatever. The Ethical Consumer is a little bit like Which, but they rate on the ethics of companies rather than the whatever which rate on, the quality. So you do have to pay a subscription for Ethical Consumer. We had a subscription, so I've just screenshotted this off that a couple of months ago. So they rate Nest as the highest most ethical pension provider, and as I mentioned, they have divested from fossil fuels from Nest. Obviously take financial advice before you move your pension. Also, just campaigning. I just sort of reflected earlier, we haven't really covered campaigning much in this whole session. I mean, it applies to all the consumer issues, as well as just choosing to avoid the bad options, as it were. We can also be campaigning for those with those companies that are not kind of providing the good options, as it were. But in terms of campaigning on finances, we can be campaigning for organisations to divest. So that big long list I gave earlier of organisations that have divested is largely as a result of campaigning actions, encouraging them to do so. So just a few campaigns you might want to look at. 350.org is an organisation that is entirely about divestment campaigning. The most current campaign in Britain is the Bank of England campaign, asking the Bank of England to stop funding the climate crisis. So there's a petition you can sign there. There is some good news on that front recently, that the last budget, Rishi Sunak has announced that part of the Bank of England's remit must now include supporting the transition to net zero. But I think the campaign continues, so they must still have some campaign asks there. You can think about the institutions you're involved with, your workplace, another organisation that you're involved with, are they divested? You can encourage them to do so. I've already mentioned the Fossil Free West Yorkshire Pension Fund campaign. Even if you're not a member of this pension fund, we're all taxpayers in West Yorkshire, and so that's actually public money that's going into that fund, and a lot of it going on fossil fuels. So there are some actions on that website. 2 of the 3 actions you can take as a local resident rather than a pension fund member. And then there's the Bright Now website, which you might just be interested, which is a campaign for churches to divest. So yeah, it's pretty much nearly 9 o'clock, so leave it there. I'll just leave it up just in case anyone wants to take down any of the links. Do you want to maybe, oh, you can't put the links in the chat, can you? Yeah, and on that front, the next session that we're doing is actually on campaigning, which is on this slide. Yep. 20th and 25th of April. So it'd be great to see you there. It'd be good to maybe start having some conversations about how we can kind of mobilize as a church to use our collective power in campaigning. So yeah, that's it. thank you everyone for coming. Just as a bit of a joke, I made this slide I wanted Ewan to use in his presentation and he refused to use it, but I'm going to put it in because we've got 1 minute left. If you're a gardener, please, please, please do not use peat in your gardening. Even Monty Don says so, because peat bogs are a massive carbon sink, so they're really helping the environment, and it takes thousands of years for the peat to form, and then, you know, a minute to dig it up with an industrial digger. So please don't use peat. It doesn't fit anywhere in the structure of the presentation, but I'll leave you with that message. So I've got a thumbs up there for Enid. So yeah, thank you very much everyone. I know it's been rather a whistle stop tour and we've been through a lot.